Mic check 1 2. It's the Y2K collector taking a quick break from doing the Marvel vs. Capcom 2 practicing. I know that with the release of the Marvel vs. Capcom 2 collection, there are going to be a number of tournaments on the horizon, and I just foresee nothing but competition all day long. I wouldn't be surprised if GameStop decided to host competitions. It's going to be very exciting. I don't know if the level of competition, if we'll see it reach the Smash Brothers level. I feel like Smash Bros is just like an international, like the competition when it comes to Smash is just crazy. So I don't know if we'll see the same level of competition when it comes to the Marvel vs. Capcom collection. And then also which game within the collection is going to see the most competitive battles, right? Like, are people going to be competing more in MVC2? Is it going to be the original Marvel vs. Capcom that a lot of people engage in? Will it be Marvel Superheroes versus Street Fighter, X-Men versus Street Fighter, Children of the Atom, Marvel Superheroes? We don't know. And the reason why it's important, because although the movesets for all those games are pretty much the same, they all have a very different feel. I would say that out of all the ones that are going to be on the collection, Marvel vs. Capcom 2 is probably the most fast-paced, has the most options, so we'll see how that all works out. But I wanted to talk about some potential snubs from the collection and whether or not Marvel should have included, or Capcom rather, should have included these 3 games specifically into that collection. Now, I was never really I didn't really understand too well why the Punisher of all games was included in that collection. One of the commenters on my channel made a good point. You know, of all the additional games, or of all the additional beat 'em ups that you could have added to the Capcom collection, you could have added Captain Commando, you could have added any of the Final Fight games to that, but for some reason they chose Punisher for some reason. And the only thing that I could think of is because Punisher does have some Marvel characters in it, obviously one being the Punisher, the other being Nick Fury. But again, there are a number of other Marvel games that I feel like could have been included into the, I guess, the beat 'em up section of this collection. And I just thought it was interesting that they chose the Punisher. I'm not mad that they chose the Punisher, because I do think that the Punisher is a really good game. It's a very difficult game to get. It's very expensive if you try to get it on the Sega Genesis. Even if you just try to get the loose cart, you're looking at over $100. Complete in box, forget about it, you're looking at least $300. So it's an expensive game nonetheless, and in my opinion, all the games on the collection are pretty darn expensive. So I think it's good because it's now going to afford a lot of people the opportunity to experience some of these games. But I do think, to a degree, one could think that these 3 games here were snubbed. Now, what you're looking at is obviously SNK versus Capcom Pro, SNK versus Capcom 2, and then Tatsunoko versus Capcom. And all 3 of these games are legit games. They're legit fighting games that came out in their time. And I would say that SNK versus Capcom Pro in a lot of ways feels like Street Fighter Alpha 3 or Third Strike. That's how it feels. And I would say SNK versus Capcom 2 also feels a little bit like Third Strike-ish. It has, in terms of like gameplay and feel, and the whole like music and the aesthetic and the arcade feel behind it. They have that very much that style to them. Whereas Tatsunoko versus Capcom definitely feels more like a MVC3 kind of game, and the way it's presented and the way the characters perform their moves, and just the overall aesthetic of the game, it very much plays like MVC3. So I know that Capcom, obviously they could have took it a step further and added MVC3, but I feel like MVC3 was probably just a little bit too modern for them to include it. I think when you look at when the original Marvel Superheroes came out, which came out in the 90s, and then you begin to compare that with, say, like an MVC3, which came out pretty much a decade later, I think that the gap between the release of those games is just a little bit too wide for them to have included them in the collection. But I do think that there would have been room for them to include the SNK and SNK2 games into the collection, but I do think it was a bit of a snub. And my question to the channel is, why do you think that is? Do you think it's because of the SNK factor? Do you think that they would have needed to get some type of clearance to be able to include the SNK characters in a collection that also had Marvel and Capcom characters? I'm really interested to know your thoughts, because while these games are not my personal favorite, when you start to think about the Marvel, Capcom, SNK fighting games, these are not my particular favorites, but these are games that I think a lot of people, especially people who are like huge fans of the King of Fighters series, I think these are games that they appreciate. And I'm really interested to know why you think these two games were not included and why they got snubbed from the collection. Now, when it comes to Tatsunoko versus Capcom, I could see this one being included if they ever did like a Capcom versus Tekken release, where they included like all of the modern Marvel versus Capcom games. So a collection like that, in my opinion, would include like Marvel versus Capcom 3, Street Fighter versus Tekken, maybe Tatsunoko versus Capcom, and perhaps some of the SNK games that weren't included in the MVC collection. I do think that Capcom should do some other part to this collection series, and I'm sure they are going to have something like that in the works, but I think it would be good for those who maybe they weren't too into the Marvel vs. Capcom series or the X-Men vs. Street Fighter series, but they did appreciate perhaps some of the fighting and some of the battling that occurred in the SNK and the Tatsunoko versus Capcom games. Now, I don't think it's a far-fetched idea to think that Capcom would release something like that. We've already gotten the Capcom Fighting Collection. They've already put out a ton of Capcom Fighting Collections, going all the way back to Street Fighter 2, Street Fighter Alpha, Street Fighter Alpha 2, Alpha 3, obviously Third Strike, Double Impact, Red Earth. I don't know. Someone can let me know down in the comments. Do any of these collections include the original Street Fighter? Because I do think that being able to play the original Street Fighter or Street Fighter 1 would definitely be great for fans of retro and those who just want to go back and experience all the games in the series. But I do think that there's room, and hopefully maybe they can, before they actually release the game, they reconsider some of the beat-em-ups that they include in the collection series. I do think Captain Commando deserves a nod when it comes to the beat-em-ups that were included in the MVC collection. And if they do an additional collection where they do include games like Tatsunoko versus Capcom, I think good beat-em-ups to include in something like that would be maybe like the Beautiful Joe series. I know a lot of people remember the Beautiful Joe series. That was a very fun side-scrolling beat-em-up style game. So there's definitely a lot of avenues they can go down now that they're willing to tap into some of these older games. I'm interested to know your thoughts on what you think about this, and do you think these games got snubbed from the MVC collection, or do you think that these three will be included in another collection that they release in the future? I'm interested to know your thoughts. It's the Y2K Collector. Take it easy.